Okay.
All right, we're ready to go. All right, this is the final session of the conference on the diaspora. At this point may be for the chosen few who know when something is of great worth. But we will see if it develops as it goes. We are going to be discussing the diaries of Professor Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky. This is a presentation or a book launch that, like our conference, has been much put off. I think it's of particular importance because we put out the diaries and were able to announce them at the ACES meetings on the West Coast, and to run a conference, a small symposium on Professor Rudnytsky at the University of Alberta, at which all three of us were present, and were able to get the diaries out just in time for those events, which we were very pleased to at that point. Why I say I'm pleased that we were included in this conference. I think that not just because we three are involved in it, but I think in a very objective way, the publication of these diaries is I'll use epochal event, if we want, on it in our knowledge of the Ukrainian diaspora dating from the days of World War II and coming to the United States. And it's the reason why we want to bring this book to as many people's attention as possible. We have put up two of the chapters, two of the years of the book, 1951 and 1952, online, and the links will be sent out to everyone who registered for this conference. I view this as an enticement for them to get the full 700-page book, and hope that many will respond to this. And so I'm glad that we're able to return to this, because I think for this whole conference, these diaries will be central to many, many of the topics discussed, and of course to many of the people discussed. What I would say about it is, and I will not go into too much, because we have the advantage that we have Professor Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky's son, Peter Petrov, here with us today, and we'll be able to see the video of his presentation from Edmonton before he gives us his words, and he will tell us more on this historical find. What I will say from the point of view of Yaroslav and Itzhak, and for me as historians, we were privileged, because most people do not have such a historical find given to them. And then this was a gift that came from Petrov to us, for which we are extremely grateful. I would also like to say, before we see the video from our first presentation and hear Petrov's remarks, that I think it's interesting to have the three of us here today, because we all begin with different stances. First of all, I want to remind you we're dealing with diaries and not memoirs. In memoirs, people get to redo their narrative, do their selection, leave what they choose to leave as they remember it. What we have here are diaries kept at the time and not prepared by the author for publication, but left behind for others to deal with. These diaries have an immediacy that one rarely finds in memoirs. They tell us how one very important intellectual historian saw things on a given day, and they tell us that as he records his day. So the diary issue is extremely important, I think, and it also involved us in a number of decisions that had to be made for the three of us. The other is, we all started off with some relation, but a quite different relation in our stance towards both Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky and the text itself. That is, if Professor Peter L. Rudnytsky was going to have to deal with his father's diaries, discussions of his family, and decisions to make of how one who inherits this then must make a decision of what should be done with it. Those are the kind of decisions I think many people face in our community, and we are seeing more and more by letters, correspondence, intimate things left behind by a generation, and they have to decide whether to share them or not. And Petro will speak more on that. And I think, and I'll speak for Yaroslav at this point, but for Yaroslav, coming from Ukraine and having been awakened to historical topics through the reading of Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky's works, something many people at the moment are doing, above all because Timothy Snyder has put the essays in Ukraine on modern Ukrainian history on his reading list. But in the case, I think, as Yaroslav will be able to tell, I think much more authoritatively, what his reaction was. We had in our last session people asking him what was his reaction to the diaspora. Well, we can say what was his reaction to the diaspora's historical production and what influence it had in Ukraine by someone who never met Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky. And then I, sort of in the center, a historian, deeply shaped by the writings of Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky, but someone who knew him, who discussed many, many things with him about history, and discussed some of the people involved in this. But as well, and I'll go back to that theme later, I feel myself as having been shaped by him and a number of the other people who've been mentioned during this conference. And so therefore, my reaction was somewhat different as a historian to Yaroslav's, I think, as to what one deals, how one deals with this and how one receives it. And with that, I would like to turn over to Petro Rudnytsky, and I assume to those who will be putting on the video from our Edmonton launch.
Thanks so much, Frank. We could really go in either order with the video first and then my remarks, but I'd kind of imagine that I would first present my thoughts.
Okay, absolutely. That is your, yes, okay, as you choose, yes.
And so we'll then rewind and go back 3 years in time, and it's really the interval between the Edmonton conference and here 3 years later that I'm really going to reflect on with you today. I want to begin with expressing my thanks, above all, to Markov for his organization of the conference, but of course for all of you who have stayed to the very end. Heroyam Slava. Really. So thank you for your presence and interest in my father's work and contributions to the conference. So this is a moment of heroism of Ukraine, a moment of tragedy for Ukraine. We heard about that from the Metropolitan, and вітаємо. Говорити про не чорта, але священника, то з'явився точно в хвилині. So in 2019, of course, the annexation of Crimea and the Donbass had occurred in 2014, but in a way the situation seemed relatively normal from our perspective here, at least. When you compared to the genocidal war that we know is taking place today. In the video that you'll be watching shortly, I made a passing remark that Ukraine was the most important nation in the world, or country in the world, I might have said. And I was kind of half joking and half serious, but it was in the context of the Trump-Zelensky phone call, the Giuliani. I think Frank made a passing comment, mentioned the name Giuliani. You may hear it in the video. Manafort's activities and so forth. These were all happening. So Ukraine was emerging into sort of broader awareness at that time, but nothing like today. So it's the changing political context that we're all deeply informed by and coming to this conference in the context of. But for me also, it's the unfolding understanding of my own family history. and my father's contributions, which of course I've known about for a long time indeed, but my current sense of all of this has been radically transformed in ways that I would like to talk to you about. Just last night, I attended the play Leopoldstadt by Tom Stoppard. I strongly recommend any of you have the opportunity to see it. And of course, it was for me an opportunity. I love going to the theater, but this play in particular, which deals with 4 generations of history of a family in the context of a Jewish Catholic marriage, and the legacy of this family saga against the backdrop of the Holocaust, that resonated so profoundly for me. That kind of deepened my sort of just emotional connection to everything that has been going on in my life and in the world. I'm thinking how, sort of the degree to which my father's work has become acknowledged to be important in a way that never would have been something he could have imagined, I don't think. I certainly didn't. I think, Yaroslav mentioned that in some ways my father's career was a, quote, failure. At least the Rudnytsky family saw him in that way. And it was certainly a difficult, precarious struggle that did not go easily for him. So this is just a complete, contrast to what he experienced during his life and what I experienced through growing up with him. So I recall, Yaroslav, I think in 1991, my memory is the Café Kupol in Lviv, but you told me right away how you valued my father's contributions, and coming from a scholar in Ukraine, that really impressed me as a tribute to him. There's also the documentary film that you may be aware of that Irina Shakotina and Yuri Shapoval did. If you haven't seen it, it's a fantastically produced film, very enjoyable simply for cinematography, but the way that they tell the story of my father's life in a broader context, who gets a documentary about his life? I mean, right? That's a big deal. Of course, the publication of the diaries, what was a monumental event that we're kind of relaunching here today after it was published they were published in 2019. For me, of course, profoundly meaningful is the fact that the Ukrainian Academy in Kyiv founded the Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky program in Ukrainian studies, now suspended, of course, due to the war. But to have him honored in this way, I mean, it's just incredible for me. Many scholars have contributed to work on my father, my grandmother, the family. Marta Bolcheska-Chomyak gets, of course, the primary honor for her work on Milena Rudnytska, and Ernst Geidel, who did invaluable work moving materials that I had from my family from once we shipped them off to Edmonton. He reviewed everything. He's working on a full-length monograph on my father that will include important primary sources, including the correspondence with Stephen Fisher-Galati that Yaroslav mentioned concerning the denial of his fellowship here at Columbia. And I think you're probably right that it had something to do with suspicions of affiliations with the Communist Party, but I don't know that for a fact. I mean, Fisher-Galati, who was on the faculty, I believe at that time, knew what the story was, but did not reveal it. And so I have filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the FBI and the CIA to see if I can dredge anything up that would illuminate that. I'll probably get a lot of blank pages, but you never know. So I'm going to try that. And then, as we've just heard, Timothy Snyder. Okay, I mean, I had not read Snyder's work, but it was only earlier this summer, actually, that a friend of mine, Peter Greenleaf, who may be listening to this talk, seeing our gathering here from Stanford, California, he sent me the video of a lecture by Professor Snyder as recently as June 3rd of this year at the Yale Center for British Art, entitled Post-Colonial Ukraine, The Meanings of Resistance. Peter had seen the video and of course knew that I would be interested in it. And if you haven't watched it, it's easily available on YouTube and online. But I will just quote some of what Professor Snyder said in that lecture that just kind of blew me away. He said, quote, "In the early 20th century, arguably the most important Ukrainian family in culture was the Rudnytsky family. And maybe the most interesting member of it was a woman called Lysiak-Rudnytsky. They were of Jewish origins on their mother's side." And he continues, "One of the things which happened to Lysiak-Rudnytsky in 1933 was that as a Ukrainian activist in what was then Poland, she traveled around Europe to try to explain to people that a famine was going on in the Soviet Union. And of course, she was quite right. In 1933, a deliberate political famine took place in which something like 4 million Ukrainians were killed. For her trouble, she and those allied with her were referred to as Nazis. Nor did it matter at all to the Soviet propagandists who said this, that she was Jewish on her mother's side. It didn't matter at all that she had nothing whatever to do with a Nazi movement. Anyone at all who criticized the Soviet Union was automatically a Nazi, at least on the level of propaganda. If we mark that moment in 1933, it bears lessons it becomes easier to understand what Russian propaganda means by Nazi in 2022. It just means the people who are against us and we are trying to discredit or destroy. There's also an article, I mean, Snyder's writings are so prolific that you can spend years reading them, but also of great significance for me is his article in the New Yorker magazine of April 28th of this year, "The War in Ukraine is a Colonial War." And he sketches out the major moments in the history of Ukraine. And essentially the main point is that Ukraine has been at the center of history. You know, not just in 2022, but in the 1930s, and indeed in the 16th and 17th century. And so for me, this convergence of the centrality of my own family's role in Ukrainian culture and the understanding of the centrality of Ukraine, which I grew up thinking of as a rather marginal place in the world, to be honest with you, right? Snyder sketches out how in the 16th and 17th century, all the forces of Europe's globalization seemed to bear down on Ukraine, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was established in 1569 and then collapsed by 1795. It was finished. I will not review Ukrainian history for people who know it far better than I do. But then Snyder says, okay, all of the new states created after the First World War were destroyed within about 2 decades by Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or both. So the interwar period led to the emergence of new nation states that then were occupied and destroyed on 2 sides. Ukraine, in the political imagination of both regimes, Nazi and Soviet, Ukraine was the territory whose possession would allow them to break the post-war order and to transform the world in their own image. As in the 16th century, it was as if all the forces of world history were concentrated on a single country. He mentions again how those who tried to bring out the truth about the famine were attacked as Nazis. It was Hitler's desire for Ukrainian land that brought millions of Jews under German control. In this sense, colonial logic about Ukraine was a necessary condition for the Holocaust. He continues, between 1933 and 1945, Soviet and Nazi colonialism made Ukraine the most dangerous place in the world. Well, I think we could say it's pretty high up there today, isn't it? The major conflict of the war in Europe was the German-Soviet struggle for Ukraine, which took place between 1941 and 1945. Of course, as Snyder points out, President Volodymyr Zelensky, a Jewish person, grew up speaking Russian from southern Ukraine, is elected president of Ukraine with 73% of the vote. So this hybridity of identity of Ukraine as a nation, embodied by Zelensky, but also by my grandmother and my family, is, what is coming into focus for me in a way that I had never understood, honestly, until very recently. Yes, I mentioned how, I grew up thinking of Ukraine as a marginal country. My father's difficult and precarious academic career. He himself, of course, battled to have Ukrainian history recognized as a legitimate academic discipline. He fought and ultimately won a tenure battle over this very issue at American University, but nothing gave him greater satisfaction in life than resigning from American University and moving to Edmonton to join in the founding of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, although he came without tenure. It was not a done deal. Of course, he had remarried my stepmother, Alexandra Shchodennyky, and this allowed them to form a life together, but he then could teach and, be a professor of Ukrainian history. I think the first person with the kind of chair in Ukrainian history in North America. It's this transformation of my understanding of the family as prominent. And crucial, again, for me in all of this is drawing on Snyder's documentation of the attacks on my grandmother specifically as Nazis, despite their Jewish origin. And on the other hand, as Yaroslav's excellent graduate student, now Dr. Lysiak-Rudnytsky has pointed out, there was extensive propaganda or, attacks on my family but on the part of the Ukrainians, nationalists who did not consider them true Ukrainians. Okay, let me cite the reference. It's an outstanding article which documents the caricatures that depict them in Jewish, identities, obviously, with anti-Semitic intent. They were not real Ukrainians. They were semi-Semites, I guess it would be one where they were referred to. So if you're interested, the article is Images and Representations of the Rudnytsky Family, the case of Ukrainians in Galicia between the wars, Lysiak-Rudnytsky, Scripta Judaica Krakovensia in 2020. Okay. So they're getting it from both sides, as Ukraine has got it from both sides, right? This is the situation. And I go into, in the video that you're going to see in a few moments, the basics of the story in many ways. But it does go back to my Jewish great-grandmother, Ida Spiegel, and her marriage to my great-grandfather, Ivan Rudnytsky, and her conversion to Ukrainian Catholicism, probably, although she was in, I think, a Benedictine convent, and it could have been Roman Catholicism, but in case she became Catholic, changed her name to Olga Rudnytska and raised the family as Ukrainians, but with the maternal lineage from the great-grandmother to my grandmother to my father. And for me, the kind of thing I've never had an opportunity or thought to talk to him about or to my grandmother about was they spent much of the war in Berlin as Ukrainian students, or, he was a Ukrainian student. It was not in question, and this was accepted. It was relative normal life for them. But this origin of their family, while my father named me after his closest childhood friend, Pyotorovich, who wrote a fantastic Holocaust novel called Blood from the Sky, Le Sang du Ciel, published in French and translated beautifully into English. And Ravitch in the novel tells the story of how he was captured and interned as a prisoner in Auschwitz, but succeeded in convincing the authorities that he was Ukrainian and not Jewish, because he knew the culture so perfectly, and that a circumcision was due not to a religious ceremony, but to a medical procedure. And then in the novel, the character Boris, who is the stand-in for Ravitch, has identity papers that give him the name of Yuri Golets. So there's the duality of the identities. And I get into also a little bit how my father's father, Paulo Lysiak, I never knew. He died in 1950. I've been to his grave in Goslar. But of course, how my father ended up with the name Lysiak-Rudnytsky, or, and I ended up as Rudnytsky rather than Lysiak, that's part of the story too. The maternal lineage has been passed on. And I say in the video, I grew up knowing all Rudnytskys and no Lysiaks, except a little bit later, I met one or two, but it's part of the story also. And so I would like to write my own contribution, my own chapter to the history of my family, and I might call it Fraternity of Chasms. As you may know, I'm a professor of English, but also a psychoanalyst, and so we're very interested in the origins of identity, and this sort of explains part of why I became a psychoanalyst, as well as a historian. Psychoanalysts are historians. And the phrase fraternity of chasms I take from Ravitch's novel. And it has to do really with the kind of duality of identity, whether it's Ukrainian, Jewish, German, Ukrainian, Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian. And the phrase goes, hostility of chasms, fraternity of chasms, fraternal hostility, hostile fraternity. This duality is what I think we confront in all of these encounters between cultures. And I've been now in contact with Professor Timothy Snyder, and I hope to have a chance to meet him in New Haven and next time I'm in New York in late January, early February. In our text messages, I told him that his work had helped me to understand that my father was not only a historian of Ukraine, but himself a figure in Ukrainian history. And he responded, a hugely important figure. And I would like to end with one more quotation from the novel of Ravitch, in which the main character, who of course survives the Auschwitz imprisonment and the war, he ends up in Paris, as Ravitch himself did. He's speaking to this kind of prophetic wise woman from the Jewish community, who tells him, quote, "The one true emptiness is the life you are going to lead after we are dead. It isn't you who are in any way exceptional. Your destiny is somewhat so." So I think that applies to me. So I think we can roll the videotape. Great. And see how it sounded 3 years ago.
I would like to ask Professor Rudnytsky to address you in.
Well, I want to join Frank in thanking the organizers of this symposium, Yars Galan and Serge Sitko here at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and to all the participants and those who are here in attendance, especially Ernst Geidel and John Paul Himka, old and new friends, and especially the editors of the volume of my father's diaries, Yaroslav Bitsak and Frank Zissin. Chatting with Yaroslav, he told me that in the correspondence between my father and my grandmother, apparently they had an idea that I should become a professor of Ukrainian literature. This was not something that I ever was made aware of. And in fact, I went in the direction not of history primarily, but of literature, not of Ukrainian studies, but of English literature and comparative literature. I am the product of a mixed marriage. My mother was American, but I did learn Ukrainian from my father and from my grandfather. And I was somewhat relieved to hear from Jean-Paul Himka that my Ukrainian was at least decent in the film that was done of my father's life.
It's quite good.
That I hope you'll have a chance to see. So I didn't follow my father in a very literal sense, but on a deeper level, I think I have followed in his footsteps. As a scholar, I am very much interested in the history and theory of psychoanalysis, as well as the clinical practice of psychoanalysis. And my historical training was in the field of Renaissance and early modern literature, which I still continue to teach and value. So he was fond of the quotation from Goethe, from Faust, was du ererbt von deinem Vater hast, erwirbest, es zu besitzen. What you have inherited from your fathers, make it your own in order to possess it. So I think on a deeper level, I have very much indeed carried forward his work and his legacy. I'm really delighted and honored by the continued interest in his work 100 years after his birth and now a full 35 years after his death. And I think he would have been himself surprised, perhaps, that his work continues to be so widely studied and influential as it appears to be. He wrote really in the form of an essay. It was his chosen, I guess, genre, if you might say, and perhaps he envisioned or dreamed of writing a magnum opus, but it was not to be. I remember saying to him once in his study here in Edmonton, "Titak bahatu chitayesh," and he said, "Tumutak malo pishu." I told him, "You read so much," and he said, "That's why I write so little." I don't know if it was little in the end, but I'm so pleased to know that its impact has lasted. I did have the honor of editing his essays in modern Ukrainian history after his death, and I guess that volume was itself translated into Ukrainian. I had nothing to do with the diaries really, except to serve as a conduit. They came to me after the death of his second wife, my stepmother. She never, I think, wanted to have them published. She might have considered them sensitive, as indeed they are in some respects, but on the other hand, she preserved them. And after her death, her daughter, Oksana Dexter, very generously passed them on to me, and I knew immediately that they were of significance that was beyond my capacity to appreciate. So I called in the experts, the pros, Yaroslav and Frank, who took upon themselves the heroic task to which they've devoted 4 years of editing them for publication. As a scholar of the past, one always wants to know everything about the people one is studying. It's a little bit different when it's your own family. And so I did have a bit of a difficult decision without knowing everything in the diaries. I knew there were some sensitive passages having to do with a visit to the Jewish cemetery in Lviv in particular, as well as some details of his intimate life. But as someone committed to the ethic of psychoanalysis, which is that we want to search for the truth, and that really the things that we don't talk about actually become the ghosts of the past that haunt us, I thought it was the best way to honor his memory, to have everything published, except for a few little passages that might be of concern to descendants of other people mentioned in there. So if you want to look those up, you'll have to go to the originals because they're not included in the published versions, as I understand.
Did we do no?
Yeah.
We'll take it right.
That's up to tranquilize you to go to the archives now. And I should say also that additional donations to my father's archive will be forthcoming. After Ernst Steidl comes to visit us next month in Gainesville, I have in our garage and in our house quite a lot of family papers and documents and other assorted, memorabilia connected with my father's life, which I am very pleased to know will find a permanent home here at the University of Alberta. As Slavko has told me, you know, my father's reputation as a scholar of Ukrainian history, I guess, has been by now pretty well recognized. But I hadn't realized that he has left, as you said, sort of the largest paper trail of any Ukrainian, perhaps, of the 20th century. I don't know if that's a correct statement, but something on that order. We have the published writings, we have the correspondence, and we have the diaries. And now with the publication of the diaries, I don't know if we could call him the Anais Nin of Ukrainian studies, but we have the diaries there, and I hope that, again, they'll find a wide readership. There's no doubt that my father died too soon. Certainly from my point of view, it's hard for me to believe I'm now 4 years older than he was when he died. And I don't feel that old, to be very honest with you. And I've often wished that I could have seen, you know, he could have lived to see an independent Ukraine, of course. And now, as we wonder, what would he say about the current situation? I think he would have seen it as a tragic situation, but on the other hand, he was battling to get Ukrainian studies established as a discipline in the Western academic world, and even to have Ukraine's identity as a nation recognized. Whereas, you know, so it would not be a field that people would think was legitimate. It would be like Pennsylvania is to the United States as Ukraine is to Russia or to the Soviet Union. And so at least now we know Ukraine is the most important country in the world, right? And so we can take some consolation in that.
At least to Giuliani.
Yeah, well, and you know, there are some things that I never fully had a chance to speak to my father about. Or to my grandmother, actually, whom I, of course, knew very well and visited often in Munich after she moved back to Europe. And those include the Jewish history of the family. As most of you or some of you may know, my great-grandmother was from an Orthodox Jewish family. Her name was Ida Spiegel. And she married my great-grandfather, who was from a Ukrainian, I think, Catholic, right, family. Ivan Rudnytsky, and she became Olga Spiegel. Olga Rudnytska. So the Jewish part of the family history, what was kind of, I guess, dissociated, we could say, and she raised her children, my grandmother and 4 brothers. She was the middle of the 5, the only daughter of the 5. As Ukrainians, but of course their identity was suspect from the standpoint of the pure Ukrainians. And it has always seemed to me very kind of amazing and ironic that my father spent a number of the war years in Berlin with his mother and then came to Prague as someone whose mother would have been Jewish by birth because of, you know, her mother, and then he would have also had a Jewish identity by both Nazi and Jewish law, but had been raised as Ukrainian and survived and lived, I guess, a sort of outwardly very normal life as a student in Berlin during the Second World War. And the other issue that we never talked as much about as I would have liked was his relationship to his own father, Pavlo Lysiak. I, of course, never knew him. He died in 1949, 2 years before my birth. So of my 4 grandparents, he was the only one I never met in person. I also never met my great uncle, Lysiak-Rudnytsky, who was a scholar of English and Western French literature. So he and Uncle Mikhailo, he and I had probably most in common in our fields of interest. And I've been told I do resemble him, although he was quite a bit taller than I am. But I did visit my grandfather's grave, Pavlo Lysiak's grave in Goslar, Germany for the first time the summer of 2018. But I never talked a lot with my dad about his relationship to his dad, although there is a very moving letter that he wrote when his father was gravely ill in Goslar. He was in Geneva and wanted to get permission as, I guess, a displaced person to travel, and he never got that. His father died, but it was a moving, beautiful letter, which is exactly what I would have wanted to say to him had I had the opportunity. And I'm not sure if that, do you know the letter, Ernst?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so, you know, it'll be published, I hope, or you'll have a chance to see it. So it is interesting, of course, that his father's name was Pavlo Lysiak. It was his mother who was Milena Rudnytska, and they split up when my father was very young. And he was raised primarily by his mother, and I think not very close to his father growing up. And when they came to this country, he became Lysiak-Rudnytsky. And then I became Peter L. Rudnytsky. Of course, Lysiak is my middle name, and he did ask me always to use the L in my professional publications and work, so I do always make a point of doing that. But it is a kind of matriarchal lineage that has been passed on through my father to me. And growing up, I knew the Rudnytsky family intimately. They were the relatives I knew. I barely knew any Lysiaks, although I did meet one or two a little bit later on, Bohdan Lysiak and others. But it is a kind of interesting dimension of his personal story, as well as, I guess, of mine. And I don't know if that is a broader significance, but it's at least interesting. And then on the question of the Jewish heritage, he did name me after his closest childhood friend, Piotr Ravitch, who was a Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian writer who was imprisoned in Auschwitz and was, I met him in Paris in 1967 one time. And he wrote a wonderful Holocaust novel called Blood from the Sky. Ravitch, like others, took his own life tragically. And Blood from the Sky has to do with the covenant of the circumcision. And Ravitch, having been arrested by the Gestapo, managed to persuade them that he was actually not Jewish, but Ukrainian, and that his circumcision was actually due to a medical procedure. And so I thought of the irony of how both Ravitch and my father had this dual identity of the outward Ukrainian and inward Jewish, okay? And so the degree to which my father was concerned with hybrid identities and the complexities of personal and national history and identity, as well as, I think, a deeply rooted cosmopolitanism and aversion to narrow forms of nationalism, I think can be understood in somewhat in relation to this story. So again, I'm so honored to be here, and thank you all, and look forward to hearing more about the diaries.
Okay. All right. Now, I'd like to ask Yaroslav to please tell us a little more about the diaries and his view of their impact on Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky's.
Just thank you so much. Just follow what just Peter said, that I really believe there is not that many Ukrainian historians of the stature of his father. In my understanding, he's the best 20th century historian of Ukrainian history. And what was very remarkable, there are certain paradoxes about him, that regularly historians don't have that much eventful life. Their life basically are made by books and articles that they publish. And this is not the case with Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky. This was extremely eventful life, many adventures. And I would say also this life has continued after his death. This is life after life, which he would enjoy immensely. Probably during the life, he never get this kind of so to say, apprehension as it has now, and quite deservedly. And in this sense, I believe a diary brings many events which were not, which we didn't know before. And it even didn't concern him. I believe that none of this paper that was presented today would be possible without these diaries, because diaries has details on every of this topic that was presented. The diary has also very interesting details of Peter Lysiak-Rudnytsky, of Peter Rudnytsky life. And probably he read it from the very beginning. But also, I would say one of the most important part in this diary is very detailed description how life looked like in Nazi Berlin. This is probably the most amazing part in many details. I believe that any historian who will deal with the Berlin history, Nazi time, had to do nowadays for him, Lysiak-Rudnytsky is a must. And the other amazing story, it's his visit to Soviet Union, first to Moscow, then to Kiev, 1970, 1971. It's a very detailed report of everyday life. And this, I believe, was the first value for any person who deals with the Soviet history, particularly with Soviet history of Ukraine. So this is, I believe, any one of us who's dealing with the 20th century, particularly 20th century of Ukraine, can find a very rich details in this diary. Therefore, I believe diary is a must nowadays for any historian who dealing with the 20th century. I have to, first of all, thank Peter and Frank, because this is them who initiated the work on this diary. There's also a team of my colleague, mostly younger scholars, who work on this diary. It was very much, to say, tumultuous work, because the deciphering of the diary was not an easy process. I believe this was particularly well done by Oksana Dmitarko, who is a master at this sense. She was very careful in typing then checking the accuracy of this diary. Actually, I'm very glad that this diary has been published. It's really true, but not, I believe it has been republished now. First, because Ernst Gödel, whom Peter mentioned, found a new part of the diary that has been published, 1937. And secondly, if you check the diary itself, it's printed in very small letters. The reason being that our publisher said there's no way to have this published diaries in one volume, given the size of the diaries. And I regret it very much, because I believe not many people could see it handy to read this diary. So I'm very strongly supporting the idea that in a few years we have to republish it, probably in new publishing house, with these editions that was found by Ernst Gödel. And I still have a hope that since we have some gaps in the diary, probably there are still some documents or some kind of archives. I wonder if Peter checked his archive, what he has in his house. I still believe there may be some part that has been unpublished. So actually, I strongly, I very much enjoy, this is probably formal word. As I said, it's really true. It's a pleasure to work with this diary. It's a must to read for any historians, and I'm particularly grateful to Peter and to Frank to make this diary possible to publish. Thank you so much.
Okay, so first I want to thank Yaroslav for doing such a wonderful job of convincing you to purchase this edition, which we are selling today.
I'm sorry,
you
Frank.
that it can be read. We will someday put out maybe a bigger edition, but you must get it now. Get it hot, if not off the press in the first year, at least soon thereafter. What I'd like to do is just fill in a few parts before we open up to questions. First of all, I want to share with you the horror that almost was committed, that these various notebooks and calendars were packed up and shipped from Edmonton to Florida to be in turn shipped back to Toronto. And at that point, we had no copies of them, no digitalization, no anything. So there was always the disaster that could have happened had things gone wrong with what we did. Fortunately, they did not. Then, although the handwritings were generally not awful, sometimes they were not easy to decipher. But what I want you to do when you look at those of you who are present at the launch, look at this volume, turn just to the index of the volume and look up someone you're interested in. And you're very likely to find so many of the people active in the intellectual life, academic life, and cultural life of the Ukrainian emigration mentioned. And then I want to remind you that these are diaries. They are not memoirs. So he tells it like he saw it that day. Some of the things, some may not be totally satisfied with. And in some ways, he may have changed his mind later on about some of these people. We will never know, because what he left to us are diaries and not a rethinking of his past. So you're going to get it as it was. Now, what do I mean that it's exciting to read? Because he doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So I particularly draw your attention to the the entry of the 8th of July, 1941, when he points out that Father Hryniok had convinced Metropolitan Shchodennyky to bless the new government that had been declared. And next to Metropolit, he puts in parentheses, Vin je vis, with an exclamation point. So this meant on the 8th of July, Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky in Krakow had no idea if Shchodennyky was alive or dead. I mean, to me, this was a moment when I reached it in the reading. I thought, yeah, this is something that is fantastic, because you can see him as he changes, as things happen, and he doesn't know what the outcomes are. There is another entry on the 23rd of January, 1944, in which he points out that he received a very sad letter from his uncle, Mikhailo, who we just mentioned, and that Mikhailo had decided to remain in Lviv. Хоча рахується з приходом большевиків і впевнений у тому, що це буде його погибель. And then the next sentence is about his going that evening with his mother to a film in Berlin, Großstadt Melodie, which was based on Berlin motifs. And then he says, ale nyní це тільки історичний мотив. Berlin лежить у розвалинах і не знати whether it's going to be rebuilt again. So when Yaroslav said that anyone who wants to know about Berlin during this period has to turn to it, I think that's true. And then when we get to 1951 and we're in Neu-Ulm, he tells us that, oh, Vasil Rudko showed up. We had a very chaotic discussion for hours in a hotel room, together with Osadchuk, Bogdan, of course. Vasil is staying now, living with Boris Levitsky. And then he tells you, well, I should point out that the major event of the day is I met Ottoman Bulba Borovets. And he has a whole discussion of Bulba Borovets and his UPA. And later in the same entry, we find out in the same day that he also met with President Mykola Levitsky, and recounts that Prytzak had a rather dim view of what Prytzak called the Prezidentko. And then later in that day, we find out that he and Rudko had a long conversation on Ukrainian-Jewish relations, and he viewed the ideas of Rudko, which he recounts on differences of Jewish and Ukrainian mentality, as very interesting. And it concludes with a discussion of his doing a habilitatia at UVU and his meeting with the UVU professors, and finally finding out that maybe the only way to do it was to turn in the work, and he would do the lecture that is given for habilitatia when he gets to New York. That's one day in this diary. So what I want to point out to you, it is so rich in knowledge of people, of discussions of what they thought at this time, that all of you, I think, will find these of worth. And then just a few comments on my own reactions. What I got out of this, first of all, was how clearly Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky's intellectual formation was German. German academia of the best part, and that even in the horrors of the Nazi era, certain elements of German academia remained, and they very much formed his thought. I also came out of them reading as someone who knew many of the people like Omelian Prytzak and Igor Shevchenko, who had very complex relations with things Polish. Those I don't find in Rudnytsky. There's a distance from the Poles and then a desire to come to an accommodation with them, but certainly not the kind of complicated issues that are involved in both the identities of both Shevchenko and Prytzak. I also, as someone who had a Humboldt Stiftung grant once, was amazed to find all these Ukrainian students who did have grants from the Humboldt Stiftung or club, and were getting grants in Germany at least up until the end of 1941, when these are closed off. And much of this discusses Ukrainian student life and desire to form journals. The book discusses all of the various factions of the Ukrainian community, and I think reveal quite how complex and varied political circles were among Ukrainians. But above all, it shows a dedication to both the Ukrainian cause, that is, throughout this period of time, as well as a dedication to scholarship, to continue on this intellectual activity as the world collapsed around them. When I think today of what we call resilience in Ukraine, when we're amazed that our colleagues in Ukraine are able to carry on intellectual and academic life in circumstances that are hard for those of us outside to imagine, I think we can look back to this group in Germany at that point. And that group that studied in Germany and then or later come through this experience much form what happens in North America. We have discussed a lot about the New World. Very clearly, Milena Rudnytska found it loathsome and hightailed it back to Munich fairly soon. Ivan Lysiak, married to, as Petro has pointed out, his mother of a Quaker and American family, deals with America, but they bring a different attitude towards it. What I find in his life, there are many discussions that deal with imperialism and Russia as a object that blocks his studies. And I recently have looked at the publications of the early 1950s. And as now we bring up this issue of decolonizing Ukraine as a colony, imperialism, you can find that all we are doing is, in many ways, is retreading the discussion that many of the generation of Ukrainian emigre scholars carried on earlier. I think in that way, it is extremely interesting as well. As I mentioned to you, we have put two years online so that we can whet your interest, so that those of you who are listening online will order this volume soon. And I think just to make sure that we remember whom to thank, if you will permit, I'd just like to read off, because so many people were involved. It's a large text with lots of identifications, and lots of work went into it. Many people assisted in preparing the diaries for publication. To begin with, we wish to thank Professor Peter L. Rudnytsky for entrusting the publication to us and permission to publish the diaries in their entirety. We are indebted to Dr. Ksenia Kebuzinski, the Slavic Resources Coordinator and head of the Petro Jacek Central and East European Resource Center at the Robarts Library, University of Toronto, for her assistance in identifying many of the members of the Ukrainian diaspora mentioned in the text. We are also grateful to our consultants, Professor Marta Bohachevsky-Komyak, Dr. Liliana Hentush, Professor Oля Hnatyuk, Iroida Vinnitsky, Uliana Kirchu, Dr. Oleg Pavlishin, and Professor Yuri Shapoval for sharing their knowledge about particular passages in the diaries. All the work required in preparing the text for publication was funded by the Petro Jacek program for the study of modern Ukrainian history and society. We thank the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter for covering the costs of publication, and of course the Duke I Litera Publishing House, especially its editor-in-chief, Leonid Finberg, for the publication itself. We also wish to acknowledge the efforts of the literary editor, Dr. Daria Siroyid, for her scrupulous work on the text of the commentaries, and Dr. Kristya Nazarkevich for her translation into Ukrainian of the passages written in German. Pavlo Hrytsak and Roman Senkus translated the prefaces into English and Ukrainian respectively. We are grateful to our recently deceased colleague, Andriy Makhuk, 1956-2019, for taking charge of the inventorying and scanning process at the CIUS Toronto office. A particular debt of gratitude is owed to Dr. Yaroslav Hlistyuk, Oksana Dmiterko, and other colleagues at Ivan Franko National University and the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv for undertaking the tremendous work of deciphering and verifying the text and writing the commentaries. I would also like to point out that this volume forms number 6 of the Biblioteka Ukrainy Modernoi Seria, Spohady Shchodennyky interview. If you have not looked at the books in this series, I much recommend them to you. And at the moment, as my colleague Yaroslav has said, we have interviews with Ihor Shevchenko to deal with ahead of us. With that, I'd like to thank you for taking part and open up to questions from our audience or questions online, or comments by my colleagues.
Any questions here in-house? Oh, yeah.
I actually had the pleasure of listening to Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky lecture at the Harvard Summer School when John Paul Himko was teaching, and he brought in Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky as a guest lecturer. It was quite incredible. I mean, the other very strong memory I have is that he and Omelian Pretsak, there was a circle of people who were taken with the ideas of Vyacheslav Lipinski. And I wonder when that started. Are there any clues in the diaries that of when that dates back to and how it happened?
If I may, I have a short response. There is none, and this was surprised me because I hoped that I will find a lot information on the subject, but until 1933, there is none reference to Lipinski. Even so, Ivan Lysiak-Rudnytsky read a lot. He was extremely aware reader, but nothing on Lipinski. So I presume it came rather late. I would guess 1937, 1938, but not earlier. Also, the one other amazing fact that before that age, there is no inclination that Lysiak-Rudnytsky would think about his career as a historian. His ambition was become a writer, and there's nothing on history. So there must be something happened, I believe, right before the war, 37, 38, 39 probably, that he changed his mind.
Okay, and I just checked quickly. There are about 25 mentions in the index to Lipinski. And the first one is on page 88, so I am going quickly. And so the first mention of Lipinski is in 1940 in the diary as it is. So we don't have it. Yaroslav can tell more about Lysiak-Rudnytsky's problems with the Hetmanite movement. But certainly Lipinski doesn't score high on this at least as far as the diaries are concerned. The correspondence may be very different.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your generous mention of my Milena working. I had the sometimes dubious honor of not only knowing Lysiak-Rudnytsky well and other persons of the Lysiak family, but frequently hosting him. And there is, I don't know, I'll share the intimate moment with you because there are so few of you here. But listen.
We won't worry about the people watching online.
Yeah, the people watching online. But Lysiak-Rudnytsky at one point tried to organize my personal life and felt that I was not marrying the right person, and actually tried to convince the man I eventually married that out of the needs of the Ukrainian society, he was not a suited pair for me, and I should marry another person. In all seriousness, Lysiak was very instrumental For those of us growing up in Philadelphia, and in large measure, Lysiak's writing sort of sometimes reflected the conversation carried on in our house. He once came over and inadvertently met my uncle and had a very nice conversation with him. But we had organized some kind of a student organization. And because Philadelphia was very strong in the Bandera part, and our family was very, well, my immediate family was very critical of the Bandera faction, we organized a meeting for the students and the leaders of all the emigre political parties in Philadelphia, and invited Professor Rudnytsky to lecture. And I think that was his first public appearance on the Philadelphia screen. And he entered into a very heated discussion with Professor Mirchuk, exchanging views. So I thoroughly appreciated the publication of the diary. I didn't know, and was not surprised by the literary finish of what was the first of his writing. I suspect that Milena's influence was strong in that respect. Also, Lysiak was blessed with a nature that would not be hurried along and would not be moved. And sometimes we of the younger generation found that a bit difficult to bear. But he always made certain that whatever he had planned for the day would occur on the day. And he would also be very insistent, if he needed help, that help would be forthcoming in whatever fashion that help was needed. I commend you, Peter, for your courage in agreeing to publish it, and to your generosity to the Ukrainian Historical Society group for sharing it with the rest of us, and for Frank in shepherding it to its completion. Thank you.
Any more questions in-house? Yes. Archbishop.
Clearly, it's being relaunched for a reason. The book it came out at a time when there were lockdowns and other difficulties, not to speak of the war. But has there been any reaction in Ukraine or in other scholarly literature? I mean, you referred to some, Peter, to some reaction. Has there been, has it hit kind of the scholarly community in Ukraine since it came out?
Okay, so I'll take partially. It won a prize. Slavko, you know what prize it won, so please say what.
It was the prize for the best book, academic book, in the biographies, believe, and diaries. Biographies. It was 19 best books in the academic biographies.
Yeah. There have been a few reviews, one by Volodymyr Kravchenko in Krytyka. There has been a Polish review, as I remember. but not what I would hope. What is difficult to tell at the moment is, are we getting those copies that they've got at Duki Litera out to people there? At the moment, this is where they stood. I think we should have asked people in the conference, by the way. It would have been an interesting poll to have done to say how many of you have read them already or looked at them. Because as I say, it would be hard to do anything on the Ukrainian diaspora or the Ukrainian community in North America or anything academic without taking a look at these as they are at the moment.
I'm aware of one review published in Russian, and it would be helpful perhaps to gather the scattered reviews so that we have a single file that would allow us to track any reception of the book.
Yeah, and we may have that in our office as well. Yeah, I'd have to check on. Okay, any other?
No more questions here.
Okay, so I have one question from Yanis Tsigakis asking about whether Ukrainians were considered Untermensch and how is it that they could study. Yes, they were considered Untermensch. It says that Slavs were. Obviously, the Germans differentiated in their policies. The Slovaks and the Croats were Slavs, and of course were allowed to form subordinate states or puppet states. The Ukrainians were not allowed to because of German race theory. There was a period, particularly after the Soviet Nazi pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop, when Germans, some forces in Germans thought that the Ukrainian issue might be of importance. Of course, that's above all the issue of Carpatho-Ukraine as Czechoslovakia is partitioned. And that partially explains, I think, at least for those who were in Germany at a very early period, why they're able to enroll in universities. And then if Yaroslav remembers at what date that they are no longer permitted to enroll in German universities.
No, there has been special permission, I believe. It lasts until 1944.
That they could
Since
remain.
1940 to 1944.
But I thought they couldn't enroll anymore. They could remain, but not enroll after a certain point, I had thought. Yeah.
I don't remember details.
Okay, so we would have to check on that.
I wanted to respond to Pani Marta and just tell you that when I wanted to see the diaries published, that was without knowing what was in them. I mean, so I really had no idea what I was saying yes to, except that I figured it was important historically, and the diaries had been preserved in some way for posterity, and if they're not published, they're going to be lost. So it was on that basis that I made the decision. I've read some small excerpts that have been sent to me, especially in electronic form. And I also wanted to just raise the question of whether we might not consider publishing the diaries in English translation. We all, of course, cherish the Ukrainian language, but it limits the readership severely for the diaries. And a project I'm working on in the field of psychoanalysis on the Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenczi, whose writings are in Hungarian and German. We're making use of a very sophisticated computer translation program called DeepL that does a remarkably good job of rendering the language and the feel of the language. I mean, you'd think you need a human being to do it, but really the computer is extraordinarily good. Obviously, everything would need to be checked for errors that can creep in, but it would radically simplify and expedite the work of translation. So if there's interest in that, I would strongly, support that project, which would immediately make the documents available to the wider audience that may not be able to read them in Ukrainian.
Yeah, I think translations are good. Having just finished the Hrushevsky translation, there's a moment at which I thought, oh no, but these are all worthwhile and with newer techniques. What I might add is, I think the first project in my mind is to get the essays on modern Ukrainian history out and maybe expand it by a few more essays that we do translation on. And then yeah, sure, we could look into this. We have hopes of, I think, of as well, looking at correspondence that might be worthwhile, as well as you're dealing with Ernst. So we would see what we can do on it.
The advantage of doing the diaries is that we have a complete electronic file.
Yeah. Yeah.
So then it can be
Faster to do. Yeah, yeah.
done almost immediately. The actual work of the translation, then you just have to proofread for errors. But it should be fairly straightforward, whereas if you have, printed documents that all need to be scanned and,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's a much bigger enterprise.
Okay, we will carry on and talk on.
No more questions here.
No, I think.
I want to thank again the two colleagues who unfortunately could not join us in person today, but Yaroslav and Frank, serdeczno wam dziękuję za все for your
Thank you.
remarks today and for your work on the diaries.
Okay, and thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, with this, I close this session and turn it over to Marco to close the conference.
No. Okay, well, before I close the conference, I want to remind people to go and purchase a copy of the Shchodennyky one more time. And I want to thank everybody, all the wonderful presenters. We had a wonderful group together for 3 days. And I want to thank everybody who came and contributed to the discussion, people that did this on an unusually beautiful New York weekend with these beautiful windows and foliage outside. But thank you for, I think, adding to what was a wonderful 3 days discussing the Ukrainian diaspora in North America and the establishment of Ukrainian studies here. Thank you.
Моя приємність і велика честь.
Чудовою презентацією. Просто прекрасно з вами нарешті познайомитися.
Залишаємося в контакті.
Так, бо ми маємо розмову, повернемося. Я хотіла вас запитати, чи вам вже передали ті матеріали, які ви просили Сергія Ціпка, щоб знайшли в архівах?
Я не шукаю.
Але ми там